So I'm going to start today's sermon with a story that happened to Keith and I many, many years ago. I won't tell you how long ago. We were on our way back to Illinois. We had been to Wisconsin and Canada and a part of Michigan and Upper Indiana on our honeymoon, and we were going to stop by Keith's mother's house. For those of you that don't know, Keith is my husband. We were going to stop by Keith's mother's house. And as we turned down the street to get to her house, we noticed barricades across the road, the street she lived on. And we're kind of wondering, what is going on here? Why can't we get to Mom's house? Well, there had been a flood in the area, and her house was one of those that was flooded. Now, in the Midwest, and she lived outside Chicago in Aurora, Illinois, and in the Midwest, most homes have basements, and hers did. Hers had a basement. But what was unknown to Keith's mom and his dad when they bought the house was their house had been built in a floodplain. And that year just happened to be the year that there was a flood. Now, generally things probably would have been okay because the floodwaters filled the basement, but they didn't really get up to the first floor. Well, they would have been okay if the builder had built a strong, firm foundation. But the concrete block walls that built the walls of the basement that went underground, because the house was actually, the first level of the house was on street level, the walls of the basement were built with concrete blocks that didn't have any reinforcement. There was no rebar holding those blocks together, no sheets of metal that hold each layer together. So the back wall of the basement, with all the floodwaters and the weight of those waters pushing against it, crumbled inward into the basement. It wasn't a strong foundation. Nothing had tied that foundation to the house, the floor above it. Nothing had tied those blocks together. Nothing, except a little mortar. Needless to say, Mom had her hands full in trying to get insurance coverage for it and a loan to pay to get things repaired. In today's story, Jesus is comparing the words that he had been speaking to the crowd he had been speaking to. So he's comparing his words and the practicing, and this is an important word, the practicing of his words to a firm foundation for life. This story comes at the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And I know many of you here that have been listening to me preach for however long you've been listening, heard me speak about the Sermon on the Mount for several weeks, a month or so ago. But I would like to know, do any of you remember some of those commands, some of those words that Jesus gave in the sermon on how to live? This is the sermon that began with the Beatitudes. The blessed are those who, sayings of Jesus, the poor in spirit, the ones who mourn, the meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the merciful, the poor in heart, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, the persecuted. And in that same speech, Jesus reminded his followers that they were the salt of the earth and the light of the world. But if salt loses its saltiness, it's no longer good for anything. And who in his or her right mind would hide their light under a bushel when they're supposed to let their light shine so others can see, and even so the person with the light can see? You know, you use a flashlight, right, when it's dark. Jesus also talked about anger and adultery and divorce, about making promises in God's name, about taking matters into one's own hands and not trusting God. He talked about retaliation, getting even with someone. Rather, he told them, don't get even, but love your enemies. He taught about sharing what we have with one another, and he taught the disciples how to pray. Our Father, who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. He taught about fasting and storing up treasures, not worrying and not judging. And he taught the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And later in the Gospel of Matthew, when the Pharisees asked him, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus summed it all up in these words: you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: you must love your neighbor as yourself. I want to suggest a way of understanding the firm foundation that Jesus is trying to teach and the individual teachings of Jesus. I kind of want to understand it as structural engineering. Now, I'm not an engineer, nor did I study engineering at all. But when looking up information on foundations and related matters, I came to understand that the foundation is the entire structural system at the bottom of a building that transfers the weight of the building safely into the ground. You might think of it as your legs for your body. Your legs, including your feet, are the foundation. They're what allows you to stand up. But there's also the muscles and the ligaments and the tendons and the nerves and the bones and the blood. They're all the foundation. But your feet might be the footings, because your feet are part of what stand on the ground and spread all of that weight that's above them out onto the ground so you don't topple over. Footings attached to a foundation take the weight of a building and spread it out evenly. Footings help keep the foundation from cracking and splitting. So what is the strong foundation for human life? What are the footings that keep that foundation from cracking? For me, for Christians, the foundation is faith in God. Faith that trusts fully in God to be there for us in the good times and the bad times. But foundations can crack, especially when things get tough, when floods come and winds blow, when we get ill, when we suffer a loss, as we age, as we move. Many things can cause our foundation of faith to crack. Even good things like graduations, because you're going to be moving on to a new chapter in your life. The graduates are moving on, some of them to more schooling and others to jobs. And as I told one this morning, you're going to have to be adulting now. In other words, we all move on at periods in our life at different times. Some of us are taking care of loved ones. Some of us have the responsibility, well, we all have the responsibility of taking care of ourselves. These are good things, and sometimes our faith, even in good times, can fall by the wayside. Or perhaps I should say, sometimes tending to our faith falls by the wayside. Our faith that is often shown in our actions, the faith that Jesus taught in the words of the Sermon on the Mount about how to live in relationship with all of those around us. The way of living that I would call the footings for our foundation of faith. Some of the interesting information I learned this week about both footings and foundations is that there are many different types of both, and that choosing the correct type depends upon both the climate and the soil of the area where the building is being built. A concrete slab is fine in the area of North Carolina, where the house that Keith and I just sold is located. The soil is stable and it drains well. But on the Atlantic coast, on the ocean, the other ocean, On the Atlantic side of North Carolina, the homes on the beach are built on deep piers that go way down into the ground. And the homes, actually the first level, are up and they're high above the ground, above the beach. Footings, those things that keep our foundation steady, come to us in lots of different ways. In a spiritual life, in our faith life, they may come to us through coming to worship, like what we're doing today. They may come to us in reading the Bible, or books about the Bible, or books that tell stories of faith. Tending to our faith can be found in the way we live our life. Feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, freeing the prisoner, all of the various ways that Jesus mentions later on in the Gospel of Matthew, that caring for someone else is the same thing as caring for Jesus. It is a footing for our foundation, for our faith. Tending to our footings is also found in caring for ourselves. Remember that. Jesus taught, love your neighbor as yourself. One cannot love a neighbor when one does not care for oneself. I'm saying that to the students because I know that for you, there are a few years left of long days and long nights with lots of homework, sometimes all-nighters, but you have to care for yourself. Yes, it's good to have goals. It's good to I want to be a member of the Phi Beta Kappa, or I want to do this, I want to excel. But you also have to learn to take care of yourself. Because if you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to make that goal, no matter how hard you try. So care for yourself. This is true for the rest of our congregation too. We need to learn to take care of ourselves. That is helping us to nourish, to take care of our footings, which nourishes our faith. Some of you are caring for ill spouses. Some of you are working a few jobs or doing a lot of volunteer work. Some of you are still working 40+ hours a week. Learn to take care of yourself, because in doing that, you have the strength to take care of others, which are Jesus' requirements when he says, love your neighbor as yourself. He's telling you it's okay to take time off sometime. But remember to come back. Remember to come back. Remember to keep your trust in God. In all of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus teaches us the way to live in order to have a firm faith foundation. So even when a crack develops, we can turn to the teachings of the footings to hold up our foundation. For God is and always will be present with us, even when we don't feel God's presence, even when we wonder if there is a God. God is still there, never, ever letting go of us. Nourish and take care of your footings and your foundation. Amen.